1914. With a single signature, the last Tsar of Russia is about to bankrupt his own empire. It doesn't look like a dramatic moment. It's a telegram sent by Tsar Nicholas II to his uncle, announcing that the government sale of vodka in Russia will be abolished forever. The intention is patriotic. Russia has just entered the First World War, and Nicholas wants a sober army marching to the front and a sober population behind it. On paper, it looks like the responsible decision of a wartime leader. But there's a problem nobody in the palace seems to have fully priced in. Vodka sales aren't just a product line in the imperial budget, they are close to a third of the entire revenue of the Russian Empire, the single largest source of income the crown has. Overnight, one of the largest countries on earth voluntarily blows a hole in its own treasury, in the middle of the most expensive war it has ever fought. Illegal stills start running within weeks. All of that lost tax revenue simply moving underground instead of disappearing. The government scrambles for a replacement source of income and never quite finds one. 3 years later, the empire that had spent 5 centuries building itself on this single drink collapses entirely, and a revolution reshapes the map of the 20th century. That was 1914. But to understand how a clear, odorless liquid could prop up and then help topple one of history's largest empires, we have to go back nearly 5 centuries to a monastery, a teenage prince, and a decision that had almost nothing to do with getting anyone drunk. There's a document from 1751 that complicates almost everything people assume about where vodka actually comes from. It's a decree from Empress Elizabeth regulating who is allowed to own a vodka distillery, and it contains the first confirmed written use of the word itself. Notice something already? Vodka's first appearance in the historical record isn't a recipe, it isn't a toast, it's a regulation. Grain distillation had likely existed in the region for at least a century before that, with monasteries frequently credited as early producers, refining fermented grain mash into something far stronger and more stable than beer or mead. It's a process that requires patience and careful attention. Grain is mashed, fermented into a crude, low-alcohol liquid, and then heated and condensed, sometimes repeatedly, to concentrate the alcohol and strip away impurities. Monks, with their access to stills used for medicines and tinctures, were well positioned to be among the first to refine the technique into something drinkable. Poland and Russia have argued for generations over which country can rightfully claim to have invented it first, and the honest answer is that the surviving evidence from that early period is thin enough that the debate will probably never fully resolve, no matter how confidently either side argues it. What is clear is that almost from the moment distilled grain spirit shows up in Russian life, the state is already circling it, not as a curiosity to be enjoyed, but as an asset to be controlled. And what one teenage ruler did with that asset turned it into the single most important funding mechanism the Russian crown had ever built. By the time this policy was in full swing, the Russian crown was making more money off the population's hangovers than off their harvests. In 1472, Ivan III, sometimes called the first true Tsar of Russia, instituted the country's first state monopoly on vodka production and sale. He banned peasants from distilling or selling it independently and declared the entire trade a royal privilege. It was a simple, brutal insight. Grain harvests fluctuate with weather, war, and soil. A drink that people want, regardless of circumstance, does not. Over the following centuries, this control tightened rather than loosened. Peter the Great reasserted strict monopoly control after a period of loosened enforcement. Catherine the Great went further, allowing the gentry to sell vodka to the state and rewarding loyal nobles not with land but with vodka production and distribution grants, which tells you plainly which asset the throne considered more valuable. Where the state couldn't administer sales directly, it sold the rights to tax farmers, called otkupshchiki, who paid the crown a large fixed sum up front in exchange for an exclusive regional monopoly. This arrangement guaranteed Moscow steady, predictable income regardless of how those merchants actually treated their customers, and it gave the tax farmers every incentive to squeeze as much profit as possible out of local peasants, who had almost nowhere else to legally buy the drink. The results, in pure numbers, are staggering. Between 1724 and 1795, vodka's share of total Russian state revenue climbed from roughly 11% to nearly 30%, meaning that within a single lifetime, the crown had gone from mildly interested in this drink to structurally dependent on it. This system was so profitable that by the 1800s, reform-minded officials who tried to loosen the state's grip on it kept running into the same wall. The treasury simply could not afford to walk away from the income, even as everyone could see the tax farming system was becoming riddled with bribery, smuggling, and outright fraud underneath it. And what was quietly building under the surface of that profitable arrangement was about to erupt. Everything you've heard about vodka's famous 40% strength is at least partly a marketing myth, and the real story behind it is stranger than the legend. By 1861, reformers had had enough of the tax farming system's abuses, and the state monopoly was temporarily dismantled in favor of an excise tax system, opening the market to private distillers for the first time in centuries. This brief 33-year window is exactly when a Moscow businessman named Pyotr Smirnov built his distillery into the most successful vodka producer in the entire country, using continuous distillation and careful charcoal filtration to create a cleaner, purer product than most of his competitors could match, and building a brand that would eventually outlive the empire itself. But the open market came with a cost. By the late 1890s, it's estimated that roughly a third of all excise taxes owed never actually reached the treasury, lost to fraud and evasion. In 1894, Tsar Alexander III moved to reimpose a full state monopoly, arguing it would let the government both control quality and rein in drunkenness, while conveniently also recapturing all that lost tax revenue. It's around this same period that the popular legend of chemist Dmitry Mendeleev personally engineering vodka's ideal 40% alcohol content takes hold, supposedly at the Tsar's request. The real history is messier than the legend suggests. Mendeleev genuinely did study alcohol water solutions as part of his doctoral dissertation years earlier, which is likely where the connection to vodka originally got attached to his name. But the specific claim that the Tsar personally summoned him to engineer the ideal proof is almost certainly an origin story stitched on after the fact, giving a fairly dry bureaucratic tax standard a far more flattering scientific pedigree than it probably deserves. It's worth noting the number also happened to make the tax math wonderfully simple, since alcohol duty was calculated based on strength. Whatever the truth of Mendeleev's actual involvement, 40% became the fixed legal standard for Russian vodka, a standard still in use today, and by the time the monopoly was fully entrenched, vodka revenue accounted for close to a third of the entire imperial budget. So when the Tsar decided, 20 years later, to shut all of this down almost overnight, he wasn't banning a beverage, he was detonating his own treasury. And what happened next is where this story turns genuinely dark. Before you assume that banning alcohol always saves a government money and saves lives, watch what happens when an empire tries it in the middle of a war. This is the full payoff of where we started. The 1914 prohibition wasn't gradual and it wasn't cushioned. Vodka sales, which had funded roughly a third of state revenue only months earlier, simply vanished from the ledger. The government had no comparable replacement source lined up. Illegal, unregulated distillation exploded across the countryside almost immediately, driven underground rather than eliminated, and largely untaxed. Meanwhile, Russia is fighting the costliest war in its history, with a fiscal hole where a third of its income used to sit. Historians still debate exactly how much weight to put on the vodka ban among the many pressures that led to the collapse of the monarchy, alongside battlefield losses, food shortages, and years of simmering political unrest. But it is consistently named as one of the self-inflicted wounds that weakened the imperial treasury at precisely the moment the empire could least afford it. By 1917, 3 years of war, financial strain, and mounting public anger finally topple the monarchy entirely. The Bolsheviks seize power, and among the thousands of private enterprises they nationalize in the months that follow is the Smirnov distillery in Moscow, once the crown jewel of Russian vodka production, which is turned, almost insultingly, into a state garage. One of Pyotr Smirnov's sons, Nikolai, stays behind in Moscow and dies there in poverty, with nothing left to his name. His brother, Vladimir, narrowly escapes a firing squad and flees the country entirely, leaving behind the factories, the fortune, and the brand his father had spent a lifetime building. In 1933, a broke, exiled Russian sold the American and Canadian rights to his family's secret vodka recipe for a sum smaller than the price of a used car today. Here's what it turned into. After fleeing Moscow with almost nothing, Vladimir Smirnov first tried to re-establish the family business in Constantinople, then moved on to Lviv, then finally settled in Paris, restyling the family name into its French spelling, Smirnov, to sell in his new home. But he had picked one of the hardest markets on earth for the job. In a country already saturated with wine and cognac, a foreign grain spirit with an unfamiliar name barely sold at all, and the man who had once run the largest vodka producer in the Russian Empire found himself scraping by, a shadow of the fortune his family had lost. Struggling and increasingly desperate, he crossed paths with a fellow Russian émigré named Rudolf Kunet, whose own family had once supplied grain to the Smirnov distillery back in Moscow before the revolution, and who had since resettled in New York, dreaming of reviving a version of that old business for himself. In 1933, Vladimir sold Kunet the exclusive rights to produce and sell Smirnov vodka across the United States and Canada. Kunet opened America's first dedicated vodka distillery in Bethel, Connecticut, the following year, finally getting his own version of the family business up and running on new soil. It nearly failed anyway. Vodka was a total unknown to American drinkers, who overwhelmingly preferred whiskey and gin, and had no cultural context at all for a clear, nearly flavorless spirit with a Russian-sounding name. Kunet struggled for years, and eventually couldn't even afford the sales licenses needed to keep the business legally running. In 1939, out of options, he sold the struggling company to John Martin, president of a small Connecticut liquor distributor called Heublein, for just $14,000, a sum raised in part from the recent success of a steak sauce. Martin's own board reportedly thought he had lost his mind buying it. His first move was to market the drink as Smirnoff White Whiskey, leaning on Americans' one point of familiarity. Then, in the 1940s, the Moscow Mule cocktail was invented, mixing Smirnoff with ginger beer and lime, and served in a distinctive copper mug, and the brand's fortunes slowly began to shift. By 1950, vodka was quietly becoming fashionable enough that, according to Martin's own retelling years later, a group of bartenders staged a mock protest march down Fifth Avenue, carrying a banner reading, "Down with the Moscow Mule, we don't need Smirnoff vodka." Whether it was a genuine complaint or a clever bit of guerrilla marketing dressed up as one, the stunt made the front page of the New York Daily News. Instead of hurting sales, it sent curious drinkers rushing into bars across the city to try the very drink being protested. By the mid-1970s, Smirnoff had become the best-selling spirit in the entire United States. So while vodka was busy quietly conquering America, back inside the Soviet Union, the state's relationship with its own signature drink was about to take one more violent swing. led by a man who arguably hated vodka more than any other leader in Russian history. Most people assume that cracking down hard on alcohol always makes a country healthier and richer. Mikhail Gorbachev tried exactly that, and it cost him almost everything. Under Stalin and his successors, the Soviet state had continued the old imperial habit of leaning hard on alcohol sales for revenue, and by 1979, the government was pulling in more from indirect alcohol taxes than it collected in income tax across the entire country. Consumption had also been climbing for decades. Between 1960 and 1979 alone, alcohol sales nearly quadrupled, and by the mid-1980s, annual per capita alcohol consumption in the Soviet Union was estimated at well over 14 liters of pure alcohol, compared to roughly 8 liters in the United States over the same period. Numbers so high they translated to the average adult male working through half a liter of vodka every 2 days. Alcoholism had become a genuine public health catastrophe as a result, linked to rising male mortality, workplace accidents, divorce, and family breakdown across Soviet society. In May of 1985, barely 2 months after taking power, Gorbachev launched a sweeping anti-alcohol campaign. Distilleries were shuttered, vineyards in Moldova, Armenia, and Georgia were destroyed, sale hours were slashed, and official state functions went dry. Gorbachev earned the half-mocking nickname the Mineral Water Secretary, and for a brief window, it worked, exactly as intended. Alcohol-related deaths fell. Birth rates ticked upward, but the side effects were immediate and enormous. Vodka sales collapsed by roughly 4/5 within 2 years, and the state treasury lost an estimated 20 billion rubles almost overnight, echoing the exact same fiscal wound the empire had inflicted on itself back in 1914. Ordinary Russians didn't simply stop drinking. They turned to home-brewed moonshine, known as samogon, made largely from sugar, which promptly vanished from store shelves across the country as amateur distillers bought it up in bulk. Alcohol poisoning deaths climbed as people turned to cruder, more dangerous substitutes. The campaign's popularity collapsed along with it, disproportionately among Russian men, and Gorbachev himself later admitted the rollout had been far too abrupt, comparing it to taking an axe to the problem instead of a scalpel. Decades later, economic researchers studying Russia's brutal mortality spike in the early 1990s found something the Kremlin hadn't anticipated either. A meaningful share of that surge in deaths appears linked not to the chaos of capitalism, but to the unwinding of Gorbachev's own campaign once it was abandoned. What if the very thing that built this empire's finances was always destined to be the thing that could break them, not once, but twice? After the Soviet Union itself collapsed in 1991, President Boris Yeltsin issued a decree in 1993 attempting to restore a formal state monopoly on alcohol production, an effort to claw back desperately needed tax revenue during months of unpaid wages and a full-blown currency crisis. It proved far harder to reinstate than it had ever been to originally establish. By then, private distillers, smugglers, and organized crime groups had already carved up huge portions of the market, and Yeltsin's version of the monopoly ended up looking far more like a licensing and excise stamp system than the total state control of the Tsarist or Soviet eras. In an odd historical footnote from decades earlier, during a serious shortage of monetary units in the early 1920s, bottles of vodka reportedly functioned as informal currency in parts of Siberia, standing in for money that simply wasn't available in enough quantity. Even today, in parts of Russia, a bottle of vodka is still sometimes considered preferable to cash as payment for a small favor or service, a quiet, persistent echo of a 500-year-old relationship between this particular drink and the exchange of value itself. Return, for a moment, to that telegram from 1914. A single decision, made in good faith by a monarch trying to do the responsible thing, that ended up helping unravel an empire's finances at the worst possible moment imaginable. Vodka was taxed by tsars who built royal fortunes on human weakness, handed out as a reward to loyal nobles in place of land, and squeezed for revenue through a corrupt tax farming system that outlived generations of reform efforts. It was nearly banned once by a wartime monarchy that could not survive the fiscal hole it left behind, and nearly reined in again 70 years later by a reformer who could not survive the political backlash either. It was carried into exile by a broke, penniless family who had lost absolutely everything to revolution, reduced to selling their own name for a few $1,000s, and somehow rebuilt from that ruin into the best-selling spirit on an entirely different continent. Vodka isn't simply Russia's most famous export. For 5 centuries, it has been one of the most tangled, most consequential relationships between a government and a single product anywhere in recorded history, propping empires up when it was convenient and occasionally helping to pull them back down when it wasn't. Not bad, and not entirely innocent either, for a clear, odorless drink that started in the back room of a monastery. If you found this as strange as I did, let me know in the comments which part surprised you the most, and subscribe for more of these.